The year is 1600. Somewhere in the South Atlantic, weeks from the nearest coastline, a Portuguese now rolls beneath a sky choked with stars. Below deck, in the suffocating darkness, 300 men lie packed together like cargo. The air is thick with the smell of tar, sweat, urine, and rotting wood. A sailor coughs. Another prays. Somewhere in the blackness, a rat gnaws through the biscuit stores. This ship is heading for India. It left Lisbon 4 months ago, and already men have started to die. By the time this vessel reaches the coast of Africa, if it reaches the coast of Africa, dozens of its crew will be dead. Not from battle, not from storms, but from something far more terrifying, something invisible, relentless, and completely misunderstood. A disease that would kill an estimated 2 million sailors between 1500 and 1800. A disease that turned strong men into living corpses. This is the story of what it was actually like to sail aboard a Portuguese warship at the height of the Age of Discovery. And it is a story far more brutal than most people realize. To understand why hundreds of men willingly stepped aboard these floating nightmares, you first have to understand Portugal itself. By the year 1600, this small kingdom on the edge of Europe had built one of the largest maritime empires the world had ever seen. From Lisbon, you could travel to China and never leave land that had been explored by Portuguese navigators. Their names were legendary: Dias, Cabral, Magellan, Vasco da Gama. The sea route to India, opened by da Gama in 1498, had transformed Portugal from a modest Atlantic kingdom into a global power. Every year, the Crown dispatched a fleet, the Armada da Índia, from the docks of Lisbon, bound for Goa. These ships carried gold, soldiers, priests, and adventurers. They returned loaded with pepper, cinnamon, cloves, silk, and porcelain. A single successful voyage could make a captain wealthy beyond imagination. The cargo aboard the massive Carrack Madre de Deus, captured by English privateers in 1592, was estimated to be worth half the entire English treasury. But there was a problem. By 1600, Portugal was no longer the unchallenged master of these waters. 20 years earlier, the Portuguese crown had been absorbed into the Spanish Habsburg monarchy through the Iberian Union. Portugal's enemies had multiplied. English privateers prowled the Azores. The Dutch, aggressive, organized, and hungry, were already forcing their way into the Indian Ocean. The English East India Company had just been founded that very year. The Golden Age was cracking at the edges, and the men sailing these ships were paying the price. The ships themselves were monstrous. The standard vessel of the Carreira da Índia was the Nau, a Carrack, a towering, broad-hulled ship with 3 or 4 masts, a high stern castle, and a distinctive U-shaped profile that rose dramatically from the waterline. By the 1590s, these ships had grown dangerously large. King Sebastian had tried to limit their size to 450 tons back in 1570. But after the Iberian Union, merchants and shipbuilders ignored the regulation, pushing the average closer to 600 tons, with some enormous vessels exceeding 1,500 tons. Bigger ships meant more cargo. More cargo meant more profit. But bigger ships also meant slower speeds, harder handling, and catastrophic vulnerability in storms. This was a gamble, and everyone knew it. But the spice trade was simply too lucrative to resist. A typical Nau bound for India carried a crew and passenger list that could exceed 400 souls. The hierarchy aboard was rigid and absolute. At the top sat the capitão, the captain, a nobleman appointed by the crown, who governed the ship with near absolute authority. Below him, The piloto navigated using astrolabes, rutters, and hard-won knowledge of wind patterns and ocean currents. The mestre, or master, managed the physical operation of the ship, its sails, rigging, and maneuvering. The contramestre, the boatswain, supervised the common sailors and enforced discipline. Then came the specialized crew, the two estranqueros, who operated the windlasses, controlling the great square sails, the carpinteros, who repaired the hull, the califates, who sealed leaks with a paste of oakum, lime, and olive oil called galagala. There were mergulladores, divers, trained to descend beneath the hull and inspect damage underwater. There was a barbero, a barber surgeon, who served as the ship's only medical officer, armed with little more than a bone saw and blind faith. A capelão, the chaplain, tended to the spiritual needs of men who were growing more desperate by the day. And the meirinho, the bailiff, dispensed punishments and kept order over the volatile gunpowder stores. Below these ranked men came the common marinheiros, the ordinary sailors, and beneath them, the grumettes, the shipboys, young men and teenagers who performed the most grueling labor on the ship. At the very bottom were the pageants, mere children as young as 10, who ran messages and served the officers. Many Portuguese gunners were actually foreigners, skilled Germans lured by premium wages, because naval artillery was the single greatest advantage Portugal had in the Indian Ocean, and the Crown was willing to pay for the best. But rank mattered little when it came to food, or rather, the lack of it. The basic daily ration for a Portuguese sailor was 2 pounds of ship's biscuit, hardtack, a rock-hard disc of baked flour and water that could survive for months but was virtually inedible without soaking in water or wine. Alongside this came wine, olive oil, salted cod, sardines, rice, cheese, and occasionally salted pork. Fresh fruits and vegetables were available only in the first days after departure. Unlike ships of other nations, Portuguese naus did not typically carry a dedicated cook. Sailors were expected to prepare their own meals at the ship's ovens, when weather permitted cooking fires at all. During storms, the fires were extinguished and the crew survived on cold biscuit, cheese, and wine alone. And the biscuit itself was rarely just biscuit. After weeks at sea, weevils burrowed into the stores. Rats, which bred with terrifying speed in the dark holds, contaminated everything they touched. Sailors learned to eat in the dark so they would not see what crawled across their food. Fresh water, stored in wooden casks, turned green and foul within weeks. It was rationed strictly, roughly 1 litre per man per day, in an equatorial heat that could leave a man half delirious with thirst. A sailor once asked his captain for an onion to add to his ration of bread, oil, cheese, and wine. The captain reportedly exploded, demanding to know if the man wanted luxuries. That single onion, had it been made a standard part of the ration, could have saved thousands of lives. Because that onion contained something no one in 1600 yet understood. Vitamin C, scurvy. This was the invisible executioner aboard every long-distance Portuguese voyage. It typically appeared 2 to 3 months into a journey, exactly the time it takes for the body's stores of vitamin C to become critically depleted. The first signs were subtle: fatigue, a general feeling of malaise, aching limbs. Then the gums began to swell and bleed. Teeth loosened and fell out. Old wounds, long healed, reopened as if by dark sorcery. The skin mottled with bruises, joints swelled. Men became too weak to stand. Sudden death from heart failure was not uncommon. The great Portuguese poet Camões described it with haunting precision. Swollen gums, the stench of putrefaction, the helplessness of watching companions die without any remedy or understanding of why. On Vasco da Gama's first voyage to India, scurvy killed roughly 116 of his 170 crew. Magellan lost 208 out of 230. Researchers estimate that between 1500 and 1800, scurvy killed at least 2 million sailors across all European navies. And the cruelest irony, captains often mistook the early lethargy of scurvy for laziness, punishing afflicted men with increased workloads and reduced rations, the exact combination guaranteed to accelerate the disease. Some captains stumbled upon partial cures without understanding why they worked. Da Gama's crew, devastated by scurvy, recovered dramatically after eating oranges and lemons provided by local people at Mombasa. Portuguese sailors began to call the disease mal de Loanda or escorbuto, and some ships carried citrus sporadically. But the connection between fresh fruit and prevention was never formalized into policy. The scientific explanation, vitamin C deficiency, would not be understood for another 3 centuries. So the killing continued, voyage after voyage, decade after decade, with a grim inevitability. But scurvy was only one of the terrors waiting aboard a Portuguese now. The living conditions themselves were a slow form of torture. Below deck, there was virtually no ventilation. Hundreds of people, crew, passengers, soldiers, sometimes women and children, occasionally slaves, slept in a space designed primarily for cargo. Passengers paid for a small allotment of floor space and brought their own bedding and provisions. The poorest among them often ran out of food halfway through the voyage and were reduced to begging or bartering. The stench was indescribable. Human waste, bilge water, animal dung from the livestock carried aboard, chickens, goats, pigs, mixed into a suffocating miasma. In 1600, one ship even carried a live elephant, though for what purpose, no one now knows. During storms, the terrified animal reportedly bellowed and thrashed so violently it threatened to capsize the vessel. The presence of women on board was not uncommon, though it was controversial. Noblemen's wives, female orphans sponsored by the crown to be married off in Goa, and occasionally stowaways all made the journey. The crew's chaplains viewed unattached women with deep suspicion, believing their presence invited moral corruption and even divine punishment. Regular searches were conducted after departure to root out women who had boarded illegally. And then there were the storms. The Cape of Good Hope, once aptly named the Cape of Storms, was the most feared passage on the entire India Run. The convergence of Atlantic and Indian Ocean weather systems created violent tempests that could shatter masts, rip open hulls, and swallow entire ships without a trace. Outbound ships tried to give the South African coast a wide berth to avoid the ferocious Agulhas current, which ran against them like an underwater river. Armadas often broke apart at the Cape, individual ships scattering across hundreds of miles of open ocean, hoping to reassemble on the other side in the Mozambique Channel, itself a graveyard of Portuguese vessels, where treacherous rocks and unpredictable currents claimed ship after ship. The litany of disasters was so extensive that it spawned its own literary genre, the Historia Tragico-Maritima, the tragic history of the sea, a famous collection of harrowing shipwreck accounts published in the 16th century. These were not fiction, they were survivor testimonies, detailed, horrifying accounts of vessels breaking apart, of men clinging to wreckage in shark-infested waters, of survivors washed ashore on hostile coasts and forced to march hundreds of miles through uncharted wilderness to reach the nearest Portuguese outpost. Many never made it. the Nossa Senhora dos Mártires, returning from India loaded with 250 tons of pepper and other precious cargo, was dashed against the rocks of the fort of São Julião da Barra at the very mouth of the Tagus River within sight of Lisbon in September 1606. The ship broke apart in little more than an hour. Of the roughly 450 people on board, some 200 bodies were found washed up on the surrounding beaches in the days that followed. Overloading was a chronic problem. Merchants, desperate to maximize profits, crammed cargo into every available space. Ships designed for 400 tons routinely sailed with 600 or more. This made them dangerously unstable in heavy seas and nearly impossible to maneuver in an emergency. Poor construction compounded the risk. Portuguese India naus were not built to last more than 4 or 5 years. That a ship survived a single India run, a round trip of roughly 18 months, was considered remarkable. The hulls, battered by tropical waters and riddled by shipworms, required constant caulking and repair. By the time a return voyage reached the Cape, the ship itself was often in a fragile, barely seaworthy condition. To then force it through the tempests of the Cape was, in the words of one historian, to turn the final stage into a veritable hell for all aboard. Yet there was also another danger now stalking these ships, one that had not existed in the early decades of the Carreira. Around the year 1600, the Cape route ceased to be sailed exclusively by Portuguese ships. The English and the Dutch had cracked the secret. English privateers, emboldened by the capture of the São Felipe in 1587, with its detailed maps and rutters, had begun their own voyages east. The Dutch, even more aggressive, flooded the Indian Ocean with competing ships. St. Helena, the lonely Atlantic island where Portuguese returning ships had traditionally stopped to rest and resupply, became too dangerous to visit after 1600 because Dutch and English ships now lurked there. This meant that homeward-bound Portuguese ships had to endure an even longer passage without the comfort of a reliable stopover, adding weeks of suffering to an already murderous voyage. The scale of loss was staggering. Between 1500 and 1650, over 1,000 ships departed Lisbon for the India Run. A significant percentage never returned. The causes were a deadly combination: poor ship construction, chronic overloading, inadequate provisions, unskilled pilots, violent weather, rampant disease, and increasingly, enemy attack. One modern analysis estimates that the combination of navigational incompetence, poor construction, and overcrowding alone accounted for nearly 100 ship losses along the route. And yet, men continued to board these ships. They boarded because the alternative, poverty in a small, overpopulated European kingdom, seemed worse. They boarded for wages, for adventure, for the promise of private trade that might transform a common sailor into a man of means. Crew members were allowed to import small amounts of pepper and fill personal liberty chests with goods purchased in India to be sold back in Lisbon for profit. For many, this was the only path to a life beyond subsistence. The youngest pages, some barely old enough to understand where they were going, were driven aboard by desperate families who could not feed them. They would grow up, if they survived, knowing nothing but the sea. The Portuguese warship of 1600 was, in many ways, a microcosm of the empire it served. Ambitious, overextended, brilliant in design, but fatally flawed in execution. It was a vessel that connected continents, that carried the wealth of Asia to the markets of Europe, that projected the power of a tiny kingdom across half the globe. But it was also a floating purgatory, a place of hunger, disease, violence, and fear, crewed by men who lived on the razor's edge between fortune and oblivion. When the survivors of these voyages finally stumbled off their ships onto the stone docks of Lisbon, thinner, older, scarred by sun and salt, they carried with them not just pepper and silk, but the weight of an experience that most people on shore could never comprehend. They had crossed the abyss. They had seen the price of empire up close. And somewhere, in a shipyard along the Tagus, another now was already being built, its timbers freshly cut, its hull still smelling of pine and galagala. It would sail next spring, loaded with men and cargo, down the river and out into the Atlantic. Many of them would not come back. If this story pulled you in, hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because this is just the beginning. We're diving deep into the untold stories of the age of sail, the forgotten voyages, the shipwrecks, and the men who risked everything on the open ocean. Drop a comment below. Would you have survived a voyage like this? And if you want more, the next episode is already on its way. See you on the next voyage.